Hello and welcome to Talking Papers, a podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. Today, we will be talking about the paper DiGS, Divergence-Guided Shape Implicit Neural Representation for Unoriented Point Clouds. This paper was accepted to CVPR 2022. And I have the two first authors of this paper. One of them is Chamin Hewa Koneputugodage, and the other one is me, Yizhak Ben-Shabat. Chamin, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chamin. I just started my third year as a PhD. My first year I spent doing some stuff on vision and language and then fine-grained classification. But then I switched topics a little bit into my second year, especially seeing all the cool stuff you were working on. And I started working into the 3D reconstruction work.
Yeah, I know. I'm a bad influence.
Yeah. And my supervisor is Gould, who's excellent and who I also did my honors with and made me decide to keep in mind with my PhD here as well.
Cool. I will introduce myself then as the second first author. As the first author. My name is Yizhak Ben-Shabat. I'm a research fellow at the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology, and also visiting research fellow at ANU, the Australian National University, as part of my Marie Curie individual fellowship. At ANU, I work with Stephen Gould, and at Technion with Professor Ayelet Tal. This work was done back when I was still in Australia at ANU. And well, since we have 2/3 of the authors here in the podcast, let's just talk about the co-authors of this paper. So, Chamin, who are the co-authors?
Well, obviously yourself, and also Steve.
All right, let's get to it. In a TLDR kind of format, what is this paper about?
This paper's trying to address the shape reconstruction problem, but specifically in the case when we don't have normals. So there's lots of work that have been done for surface reconstruction without normals with this new type of method called implicit neural representations or neural fields. And what we try to address is, what about when we don't have normals, which is usually the case that we'd have when we get the raw information from scanners.
Moving to the introduction, what problem is this paper addressing?
So it's addressing the surface reconstruction problem. So given input from a scanner, so if you would scan with a LiDAR scanner, like a Kinect scanner, you get points in space that are essentially, you can think of them as samples on the surface of the object. So that's where the light is reflected back. And so that's our input. We have points in space that we know are on the surface of the object, and we're trying to reconstruct the surface of the object. So it's often called surface reconstruction or shape reconstruction.
And why is this an important problem to solve?
There's a big task in being able to figure out 3D geometry and structure from just images. But if you only have still images or you don't have enough points of view, you won't be able to get much information about depth. So that's why RGBD or 3D scanners are very important for being able to figure out depth in things like self-driving cars or even robotics with being able to manipulate 3D objects. So 3D scanners like LiDAR are a really good way to get 3D information out very efficiently, but being able to process that data and reconstruct surfaces and shapes is a pretty important problem.
And what are the main challenges there?
A lot of the previous work assumed that you know what the normal direction is. When you only have points and you can't make a good estimate on how finally those points have been sampled because you just know that they're whatever rays come back from the scanner, you can't make much assumptions about which way the surface is pointing. So if you do have information such as the normal direction, so which way is orthogonal to the surface pointing in the outward direction, then you can usually do a pretty good job on reconstructing those surfaces. If you don't have that information, which is usually the case from scanners, then that's a big issue, and ideally we'd be able to address that.
Yes, and there's another challenge here that I want to mention. So all of the implicit neural representations or neural fields, as they call it now, they have all shown to be very sensitive to the initialization. And this is another challenge to solve. How do we properly initialize these networks? What are the main contributions of the paper?
So our overall contribution is that we show this procedure to be able to train implicit neural representations for surfaces or for shapes without normal vectors. And to do that, we kind of have this two sub-contributions. The first one is, as you were mentioning, initialization. So technically this isn't specialized towards trying to solve this task without normals, but implicit neural representations are very sensitive to initialization. One thing about them is they're trying to fit through whatever data we're giving them, and there's lots of different possible ways to do that with neural networks, and not just parameter-wise, but also actual surfaces that can interpolate those points. So a very important thing is to bias the network towards more realistic surfaces when given those points. And one of the most important factors there is initialization. So making a good way to initialize is the first contribution that we do. And the second contribution that we do is to introduce this divergence loss, which we use to essentially smooth and regularize the function space so that when we're learning, we learn a neural field that is much more consistently orientated and much more realistic towards what shapes actually look like.
Okay, so before we dive into how exactly we do it, let's talk a little bit about related works. So if you had to name one or two papers that were instrumental in writing this paper, or that a new PhD student coming to read this paper should read first, which papers would those be?
I'm actually going to name three. Probably the first one is Deep SDF. They show that learning a sign distance function is a really good representation for shapes. And then splitting off from that work, there's this line of work from Lipman's group, so SAL, sign agnostic learning, and IGR, that show how to learn that without having complete information like Deep SDF did. And then the other one is SIREN. So we use their architecture because, along with Fourier feature networks, introduced this idea that one of the key things into getting good representations, good high detail representations in INRs, is to introduce high frequencies into the network. And so we use SIREN's method for doing that. And so that's also an important paper to read.
So before we dive into how do we do it, can you just explain the framework of implicit neural representation? So what's the input? What's the output? What does the network do?
So the idea with implicit neural representations, they were so-called neural fields and coordinate representations for this reason, is that you put in a coordinate in your input space. So for us, our input space would be 3D space. And the neural network gives out output value, could be a scalar, could be a vector for that point. And so then the network evaluates multiple points in the input space. And now you have an output value for all the points that you evaluated at input. And that can be used for lots of things. That can be used for images, that can be used for 3D shapes, and can be used for photorealistic 3D scenes like NERF does. So that's implicit neural representations. For our task, what we're using as our, I'm going to use the term neural field, is a sign distance function. So given a point in 3D space, the network has to try and learn or approximate the distance to the surface, the shortest distance to the surface, and it's signed in that if it's negative, it's inside the shape, and if it's positive, it's outside the shape. So then from that, we can extract the zero level set, which would be the surface of the shape.
Right. And traditionally, how do you supervise this kind of training process, right? So you have your XYZ as input, you have your sign distance function as output, and then you have the network in the middle, which is usually a bunch of multi-layer perceptron. But how do you usually, before what we did, how do you usually supervise this kind of training?
Yeah. So if we go all the way back to Deep SDF, they had the actual ground truth distances as supervision. And with that, they showed that this representation is really efficient and can be used to merge models together or interpolate between them. What SAL and IGR did is that they showed what you can do without having the ground truth sign distance value. So SAL assumes that you only have the points in space, and they compute the distance from sampled points in the space to the closest point on the surface, and they use that as supervision. IGR, on the other hand, showed this very nice, they motivate it from PDE, so partial differentiation literature. All you would really need is samples on the surface and a constraint, which is called the iconal constraint, which says that the gradient should be 1 everywhere. Because a sign distance function, its gradient is always going to be 1 because distance changes with gradient 1. So its gradient is always going to be 1. So the iconal constraint says the gradient almost everywhere for if the gradient isn't defined, the gradient's norm should be 1.
Right. So most methods use either a subset or some combination of the following losses. So one is the zeros level set loss, so meaning the distance of points on the surface should be 0. 2, the iconal term, so that means that the magnitude of the gradient of the implicit neural representation network should be 1 almost everywhere. 3, so the gradient of the network should be oriented in the same direction as the normal to the surface at that point. Right? And there's the 4th, which is the original one, which is the sign distance loss. So if you have the sign distance for any point in space, you can use that distance value for supervision of the network. All right. So what do we do differently?
So we don't have the normal supervision anymore, meaning the normal loss supervision.
What happens when you don't have the normal loss anymore?
When you don't have that, the network isn't able to tell which way is inside and which way is outside at that point. So one problem with INRs is that the network effectively only knows that point and it has to make a judgment about that point. There's no reasoning that it can do to figure out the rest of the space. It just has to learn through optimization what the surrounding region is. So it's very hard for it to figure out. It knows which direction is away from the surface due to sampling around that region, but it doesn't know which way is inside and which way is outside without having that normal vector supervision. So we try to address this. So we've taken out the normal supervision loss, which, as we've stated before, isn't realistic for raw input point clouds. And instead we put this divergence loss. So this is a regularization to try and enforce the overall function to be smoother and less variable so that we get our sign distance functions being oriented the right way.
So for our listeners that have done calculus a while ago and don't remember what divergence means, can you briefly or intuitively explain what does the divergence has to do with anything here?
So divergence is second order information. So it uses the second derivative, and it's really just the sum of the second partials on each of the coordinates. But intuitively, what the divergence calculates or for a single point is the trade-off between the amount of source of the function going into the point versus how much is coming out.
Yeah, so if we imagine the gradients of the entire domain, right, as arrows, right? So basically what the gradient tells us is how many of these gradients, how many of these arrows are pointing outwards from any given surface or contour that we set around it.
Exactly, yeah. And to be able to constrict a function to be less variable, it's less likely to have high divergence, because high divergence means that the normal vectors are high. I say high divergence, but it should be high absolute value of the divergence, because that means that either all the arrows so all the directions of the gradient are going away from that point or towards that point, which makes the function much more variable. And sign distance functions of real shapes should be SDFs, where this is much less variable than other possible ways to interpolate through that shape.
There are only a very small subset of points where the normal changes abruptly, right? So like the
corners,
medial axis, the corners, If you imagine even the simplest geometry, like a circle, right? And we show this in the paper. So if you imagine a circle as your surface, then there's only one point in the entire domain that has a high value for the divergence, which is the center point of that circle, because at that point, that is basically the source point. All of the gradients are pointing in different directions from that. Okay, so this is one contribution, right? We had that divergence loss. So we asked the divergence to be very low everywhere in the domain, but we didn't do it all the time, right? Because this is a bit of a problem, right? It over smooths. So what did we do to overcome that?
So as you say, it over smooths the surface. So this is a problem with regularization, overly smooths things. Because what we care about in terms of smoothing out the region is to make the training orient the normals in the correct direction. We realized we don't need that to be there towards the end of the training, because if we bias towards a smoother solution towards the start, then we're already in a pretty good position to learn the shape much better. So we annealed as in reduced the magnitude of the divergence loss. So we annealed the divergence loss as training progressed. So we usually had, I guess, 3 stages to the divergence loss. We have this high divergence loss phase where we're enforcing the network to learn a very smooth SDF for the surface. Then we have this annealing phase where it can slowly learn less and less smooth versions of that SDF, so we can gain more high detail in the actual surface. And then we have this no divergence phase where we're no longer restricted by that regularization term, and hopefully the network can then learn full level of detail of the original input surface.
Yeah, so this is like a coarse to fine kind of approach, right? First learn an over smooth shape, and then gradually allow details to come back by removing that divergence loss. Okay, so this is one contribution, right? The divergence loss. And what is the second contribution? How did we do the initialization part?
So for the initialization, what we do is that we start off with a sphere, so that we actually introduce 2 initializations. The first one is geometric initialization. So this is highly based on previous ways to initialize in the literature. So Sal does this as well. Initialize to a sphere. The great thing about initializing to the SDF of a sphere is that, well, if we initialize to the SDF, we've already gone a long way in satisfying the iconal constraint. But now we've biased the network to be in this position where outside the surface is away from the center of the bounding box of the object, and towards the center of the bounding box of the object, the SDF is negative, so inside the shape. So for enclosed compact shapes, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a very good starting point. And as I was saying, Sal does this as well, but for well use, we showed how to do it for SIRENs, which we had to use very different properties because of the way that in SIRENs, the activation function is a sine, which isn't monotonically increasing. So we had to deal with how to address that. So, and in classic computer vision, lots of people used to start off with spheres. So that's our first initialization to get to geometric initialization, which is kind of this standard in the literature. The next thing that we did is that we actually tried to introduce frequency back into this initialization. So as we said before, we were using SIRENs because to get high detail, we need to be able to have networks that introduce high frequencies back into the network. What we found when we figured out how to initialize to a sphere with sine activation functions is that it kind of was a 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It biased the network back to learning low frequency solutions. And so we weren't able to get high detail again. So the idea here then with with our second type of initialization, which we call MFGI, multi-frequency geometric initialization, is to initialize to a noisy sphere. So a sphere where there's this high frequency that is suppressed to some extent, so that you have this sphere that is really noisy on the surface. And with that, we found that we were able to both initialize with this bias towards enclosed shapes, which works really well, and we were able to retain the high frequency within the network, and thus good levels of detail in the final representation that SIRENs had been able to get.
So let me recap. In the literature, people initialize to a sphere. We said, let's initialize to a sphere too, but oh wait, there's a problem. We have sign activations, not ReLU. We need to figure out a way to do that. We figured out a way to do that. We initialized to a sphere, but it was biased. It gave over smooth results, no access to high frequencies. So we introduced the multi-frequency geometric initialization, which basically initialized to a noisy sphere, like a wavy kind of sphere that kind of had the ability to enjoy both worlds. You're initializing to a sphere, but you still have access to the high frequencies. Let's move on to the results section. So what experiments did you do?
We first did a lot of experiments on 2D shapes, and a lot of our intuitions came from that. One of the really good things about that is that you wrote this excellent test class for a bunch of 2D shapes and how to visualize the contour plots. And being able to visualize the contour plots gives so much intuition into these objects, and we give a bunch of those plots in the supplementary. For the 3D experiments, the first dataset that we used was the SRB dataset, so Surface Reconstruction Benchmark, which has 5 shapes. And these are technically synthetic shapes, but they try to make it realistic. So they both have occlusions and they have misalignments from trying to register scans from multiple different directions. But because they're synthetic, we have access to the ground truth mesh of the shape. And the other thing is that these shapes vary a lot in the type of object they are. Some of them have very sharp corners, some of them have very thin surfaces, and some of them have very high detail, and some of them have really round, sloping, but multiple sloping kind of surfaces. So to evaluate on this data set, we're given sampled points on the surface, somewhat misaligned from the scans, from the simulated scans. We run our network, which will give us our predicted SDF within the space. We specifically evaluated within an enclosing bounding box in this grid-like fashion to be able to get a pretty dense representation of the SDF field. We then give that to marching cubes, which is this classic algorithm that from discrete samples of what is inside or outside the object, so that it can figure out where the zero level surface is. It's essentially doing this lookup based on a bunch of heuristics. And from that mesh, we then compare to the ground truth mesh by the chamfer distance.
Okay, can you just explain for those who don't know the chamfer distance? What does that mean?
So it's a two-sided distance. We start off with one of the meshes, the samples on one of the meshes. For each of those points, we find what the closest point is on the other mesh, on the other set of samples. And so now for every single point here, we have a closest distance, and we take the average of those closest distance, and that gives us the one-sided chamfer distance. And for the two-sided chamfer distance, we get the other side as well, and we average the overall two distances.
Great. We also use the Hausdorff distance?
Yeah, so the Hausdorff distance, instead of averaging, it takes the max.
If you have like an outlier, or you have like what we call ghost geometries, which are basically these kind of blobs that you sometimes get at a random place in space, then Hausdorff distance would be high. Whereas the chamfer distance, even if you have one point that's an outlier, it's not going to be affected as much because it averages all of the points, right? So you can have all of the points correct except one, and you would still get a good chamfer distance, but the Hausdorff distance would be terrible. All right, so this is the reconstruction experiment, right? We had the surface reconstruction benchmark dataset. We ran our approach. We compared it to existing approaches, which include the SIREN, SAL, IGR. But we did another thing. So we didn't only compare to them when they operate in their optimal state. We also removed the normal vector supervision and compared to that, right? Because our approach basically does not use that component for supervision.
We also ran on ShapeNet. So we used a subset of the shapes from ShapeNet, and we ran the exact same experiment. Then for our final surface reconstruction task, we ran on this large interior scene that was introduced in the SIREN paper, which has close to around 1 million points. So it's this very large scene. And because it's an interior scene, it's extremely concave, which is really hard to work with. There's lots of very thin surfaces. And we showed our results on that, especially comparing our results without normals.
Right. And we showed that qualitatively and quantitatively, we can reach very good performance.
What was especially interesting, I guess, in terms of our results there, is that we showed that without normals, with our approach, apart from being able to actually learn in that setting, and we showed that even though you can technically take off the normal constraint in other methods, they can still learn somewhat too. So we showed that we do much better than them. What we also showed is that our performance doesn't degrade too much when we take out the normal supervision. So obviously our loss can also be used with normal supervision as well. And we showed experiments which show that we're very competitive to other methods there. But if we have our method without normals, our performance doesn't degrade very much, which is very interesting and shows that our method really manages to find this real good training regime to bias towards proper SDF. So our other experiment is the shape space experiment. So in this is a much harder task. So here, instead of learning a network for each shape, we learn one network for multiple shapes. And the way that that's done is we have a separate set of parameters, so a latent code per shape that is also given as input to the network. And we assume that the multiple shapes that we're trying to learn is this from this related class of shapes. So they all should be somewhat similar to each other. The data set we're using is called DFAUST, where it's scans of multiple humans doing multiple different actions, and the scans are done at different times during their action sequence. So there's both similarities by the fact that it's all human shapes, and you also have shapes of the same human just in different poses. So because we have this related space of shapes, the idea is that the network will be able to learn this general shape space, hence the name of the experiment, of this general shape space itself, and then given different latent codes, it can actually produce different objects or shapes within that shape space. So the way this is done is at training time, we're given a bunch of poses. We assign a different latent code that is set to be trainable for each of those. And we have this one network that then tries to optimize on all those shapes. And each time a shape is being optimized, it loads in that shape's specific latent code. And then at test time, the network's weights are fixed, but it's given a latent code that is then optimized with respect to the points given to it. So the test time points. So the points being the surface points on the test shape. And the hope is at test time, it will be able to optimize that latent code to eventually get to learning, to be optimized to get to that shape of that test shape. So it's this much harder task where it's one network for multiple shapes. And there's this optimization procedure also at test time with respect to the latent code so that the network can find the correct latent code for the test shape.
Yeah, I think this experiment is very interesting and is very unintuitive for the novice listener. So let me just recap this. So the shape space experiment, you get a whole bunch of shapes for training, And then you have new shapes that you haven't seen before at test time. During training, you optimize for two things. One is so you try to find the best set of weights for your network, but you also try to find this latent vector representation that is going to represent each individual shape. Then at test time, you keep the weights of the network fixed. And what you are basically trying to find is this latent code representation based on just the input points that you have. Once you found that latent code, you can then run it through the network and get your reconstruction.
What we found with this experiment was, well, one, it takes a lot more time to train than the others, but that normals was very, very important to being able to do this within, I guess, reasonable time. So already the other methods, cell IGR, they run for many more times than the surface reconstruction result. And if we remove normals, they don't actually learn at all. And even though they can learn with normals, the results still aren't really there yet. The surface reconstruction results look very decent, but the shape space results, there's usually lots of what we call ghost geometries. So regions of space where there's this ghost shape being made present in the space. They have
floating
lots
blobs.
Of those. Floating blobs. There's loads of those in this shape space experiment, unlike the surface reconstruction experiment. And so if we ran our method with normals, our procedure smoothed away a lot of those ghost geometries. Overall, we got more smoother reconstructions, even more than the surface reconstruction results. But our humans were much more consistent. A lot of the other ones, in some frames, they'd be missing limbs, replacing that with all sorts of ghost geometry, or their shapes would not be very fitting to the initial point cloud. So that's the case with normals. Without normals, they weren't able to learn at all. They just learned lots and lots of different sheets to try and essentially reduce the loss in some way, whereas our method actually was able to learn a shape that looked like a human. Didn't have very much detail at all, but it actually resembled a human shape, and it was an enclosed surface, unlike the other methods where they only had sheets.
Okay, so you're saying that the ReLU-based networks are not working well without the normal supervision. So why can't you just simply apply the divergence loss that we proposed to those methods?
Right. So we said we did it with sirens and we didn't do it with ReLUs. So ReLUs are piecewise linear. So they have a gradient, but they have at 0 second derivative everywhere. And our divergence loss is a second order loss. So it's fundamentally the sum of second derivatives. So our loss would just always be 0 in those cases.
Right. So basically the main thing is you can't use this loss with ReLUs because you already have a 0 divergence everywhere, which is not something desirable, right? The function space is too restrictive.
And the nice thing about sirens is that they're infinitely differentiable. The key thing that we found just very interesting was that on surface reconstruction, the results without normals was very similar to the results with normals when we were including our full pipeline, which shows that this is really biasing towards the correct space of shapes.
So just to recap, the shape space problem is still very challenging. I think the reconstruction gets good results for almost all of the existing methods, even ours, but all other methods have very satisfactory outcomes. But the shape space is still, I think, a very much open problem. Which brings me to my next section of the podcast, conclusions and future work. How do you see the impact of the paper going forward? And are there any interesting papers that followed it or just general other works from other groups?
Right. So obviously being able to improve shape space is a very important task. Another one is there's this big shift from frequency-based methods to get good detail to ones where they learn latent codes for different regions of the shape. So something like Englod or the latest paper by NVIDIA, which does NERF in a few seconds. So being able to tackle that without normals would be an interesting task as well. And another future direction would be some sort of synthesis between this type of approach and, well, maybe not even synthesis, but seeing whether this type of approach can be used with or complement with the type of approach that Song you talked about in the podcast in one of your previous episodes. So
Shapeless Points paper?
Shapeless Points. It's a very, very interesting paper. This new paradigm of representing shapes. And they get very good results on shape reconstruction, and they're able to learn without normals. And so is there some sort of parallels between these two methods that can be used, or some unified way of, or some way of unifying these two?
Okay, cool. Moving on to my favorite part of the podcast. What did the reviewer two say? Please share some insightful comments that the reviewer said in the review process, even the ranks, if you feel comfortable to.
Right. So we actually initially submitted this to NeurIPS last year, and our results there, our scores there was 4.745. And our initial feedback was mostly that we should have compared to SAL, which in hindsight we should have. We did it to IGR, which got better results. It was a kind of this miscalculation on our part. And there was some more discussion also about trying to talk more about the theoretical side of what the divergence loss is actually doing, which really inspired a whole new section in our second version of the paper. But in terms of what did reviewer 2 say? So we didn't provide the results on SAL. We then did give that in the rebuttal period, and our results did show that our method was a lot better than SAL. And so some other problems with SAL is that their preprocessing is very expensive, and in some settings they do use normal vectors. But the reviewers never responded to our new results, and the meta reviewer didn't address it either. And so
good thing they didn't.
It was just a bit disappointing. Yeah, and so
I think I do want to mention that the reviews were generally positive. They were just missing those experiments, and even though we addressed this in the rebuttal, we couldn't get the paper in. But I think overall, what happened in the review process was that the paper just really got better in the second round. So it's not only that we answered the rebuttal. Which is the
point of rebuttal, which Steve is telling us.
Yeah, Steve is always saying this is the point of the review process, yes. Right? So it made us take a step back, look at the paper, see everything that was missing, add that, and then resubmit that to CVPR, and it got accepted.
So at CVPR we got 2 weak accepts and a borderline. The weak accepts, they mostly asked for some clarifications, which we gave, and they seemed very happy with. The borderline seemed very confused upon our approach. They suggested that what we should do is just compute the mesh out and then smooth on the mesh, and asked why we didn't do that. So they didn't really understand that we were annealing the regularization term, essentially the smoothing throughout training, and that's just being used to guide it. So we explained that to the reviewer. They then actually turned their borderline to a complete reject, and then iterated the same thing, that we should have just smoothed it on the mesh. Maybe there was some miscommunication in how we're trying to explain that you can't smooth on the mesh. But from the meta reviewer's feedback, they kind of explained that reviewer 1 kind of championed our paper and said there's no real reason for rejection. Results are good. The approach makes sense. And that it actually went to the area chair panel to vote on whether it should get accepted or not. And they finally accepted it.
Yeah, this is usually what happens with papers, that there is some form of disagreement, right? So, and this was a paper that there was a disagreement. We're both biased, right? But
yeah, of course.
It seems that the disagreement was caused due to some misunderstanding, and we really looked into the paper to see if we missed anything, if we didn't explain anything the right way. Maybe it's everybody's always coming from their field and what they're doing. And maybe it was just this was the source of the misunderstanding. All right. So thank you very much, Chamin, for being a guest on the podcast. And until next time, let your papers do the talking. Thank you for listening. That's it for this episode of Talking Papers. Please subscribe to the podcast feed on your favorite podcast app. All links are available in this episode description and on the Talking Papers website. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, sponsor it, or just share your thoughts with us, feel free to email talking.papers.podcast@gmail.com. Be sure to tune in every week for the latest episodes. And until then, let your papers do the talking.